What's going on, everyone? Welcome back into another episode of my 5 Destinations series. Today we're going to be looking at 5 destinations for Norman Powell. Now before we get into the video, make sure to come catch our special trade deadline stream that we'll be doing the morning of February 10th. We're going to be going live early in the morning, maybe 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I know that might not be early for some of you, but it's the earliest we go live all year long. We cover every single trade over the course of trade deadline day. We'll have a special graphics package for you. Chris will be helping me out with that, so we're going to be able to do some things that we haven't before for the trade deadline stream, so that should be a lot of fun. We'll have Twitter feeds for Woj and Shams that'll update live on the stream. It's one of the funnest streams of the year, so hopefully you're able to make it. Now, as far as these 5 destination videos go, it takes a lot of time to put these together, so if you want to show some support, hit that join button below and become a channel member. It would mean a lot to me. And with that being said, let's jump into the 5 destinations for Norman Powell. The first destination I have for Norm is the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cavaliers make a ton of sense for Norman Powell. They've lost Colin Sexton for the year due to injury. They've lost Ricky Rubio for the year due to injury. The Cavs have been the surprise of the league this year. They're actually battling for a 1 seed. They're within about a game or so right now of the 1 seed in the East, so they're looking to make a playoff push without LeBron James for the first time in over 2 decades. So Norman Powell would make a lot of sense for them to bring in. He'd make a lot of sense starting in the backcourt next to Darius Garland, and they have the assets that make sense to go out and get Norman Powell. Here's the trade that I have for Norman Powell. Now, I don't know what to do with these graphics. I'm just going to put my head up here. Ricky Rubio, their 2022 first, and they can even throw in an early second round pick. They own Houston's second round pick this year, which will be between picks 31 and 33. So Ricky Rubio matches salary for Norman Powell. The Cavs actually save a little bit of money, and the Blazers would get a first round pick and maybe a good second round pick even as well. Now, the problem with this trade is it does put Portland deeper into the luxury tax, so they would need another move that sheds even more salary than they needed to before in order to duck the luxury tax. And this team is definitely going to try and duck the luxury tax this season. So, any trade that adds salary to the Blazers, I'm kind of iffy on, but they have a number of moves that I think they can possibly make to duck it, even with taking Ricky Rubio on in this trade. They could also try and flip Ricky Rubio for maybe a cheaper expiring contract or maybe a bad 2-year contract. OKC has Derek Favors on a 2-year contract making about $10 million per year, and he doesn't really fit their timeline, and the Thunder have cap space, so Portland could probably flip Rubio to the Thunder for Favors and duck the luxury tax that way. Trade destination number 2 for Norman Powell is the Atlanta Hawks. The Hawks are in a weird situation coming off a surprise Eastern Conference Finals run. They struggled to start this year, but have recently won 7 games in a row and are kind of back in the playoff picture in the East. They've had a bit of a logjam on the wing, but I think that Norman Powell makes a ton of sense as their starting shooting guard next to Trae Young, just like he makes sense next to Darius Garland. I think a Trae Young, Norman Powell, DeAndre Hunter, John Collins maybe, he could get traded. Maybe that's Danilo Gallinari, who knows? And then Clint Capella starting lineup is pretty good in the East and will be able to make some noise. I think Norm fits into that pretty well. As far as a Hawks trade goes, this is what I got. The Blazers get back Jang and DeLon Wright. They're included in this trade simply to match salary. And then instead of getting a first-round pick for Norman Powell, they get back a first-round pick from last year in Jalen Johnson, who, if he was in this year's draft, would probably be a top 10 pick. Last year's draft was extremely deep. Jalen Johnson ended up getting picked 20th, but he's a young forward that I think could excel being tutored by Chauncey Billups. The third team I have as a destination for Norman Powell, he's been linked to a lot, and that is the Detroit Pistons. Detroit apparently wanted Norman Powell in free agency last year. I don't really know why. They're on a rebuilding timeline, but apparently they want Norman Powell. Now, I don't really have a justification for it, so I'm not even going to try and explain one. I do have a few trades that would maybe make some sense for both teams, though. though. And the first one is the obvious one, that is Jeremy Grant to Portland, Norman Powell to the Detroit Pistons. Macklemore is thrown in to make the salary match. And although I'm not the biggest Jeremy Grant fan, I guess this makes some sense for Portland. They clear some space in the backcourt and they get Jeremy Grant. They bring him in. I've stated on the record multiple times in various live streams why I'm not a fan of Jeremy Grant being added to this team. But, you know, if it's just straight up for Norman Powell, I don't have as much of an issue with it compared to maybe Norman Powell and a first or 2 first-round picks. That would be a horrible trade in my opinion. Or if we're shelling out Nasir Little and a couple first-round picks and Rocco, I wouldn't want to do that either. So this is really the only Jeremy Grant trade that I wouldn't hate. The one problem with this sort of trade, though, is the Blazers add $2 million in salary, and they have to fill the 14th roster spot since they made a 2-for-1 trade. So Portland ducking the luxury tax with this sort of trade would be difficult, but I'll have something to fix that within this trade in a second. A couple other straight across trades. Kelly Olynyk might make some sense in Portland. You get back Kelly Olynyk and a couple second-round picks. Unfortunately, Detroit doesn't really own their own second-round picks for a while, and those could be pretty good second-round picks over the next couple of years. So Portland gets some second-round picks with some weird conditions on them and get Kelly Olynyk to maybe be their backup center, or if they trade Nurkic or Nurkic walks, maybe Kelly Olynyk is their starting center next season. That could make some sense as well. In this trade, Portland ducks the luxury tax and gets Isaiah Stewart, who's a young big man who could be the backup center next year potentially. He hasn't necessarily had the best season this year, but he's still extremely young, about 20, 21 years of age in his second season. He only played 1 year in college. Josh Jackson and Corey Joseph are just thrown in to match salary. Portland would also, I think, get a $7.5-ish million traded player exception in this deal to use later. But going back to the Jeremy Grant trade, it would make the most sense to swing a 3-team deal for Jeremy Grant, where the Pistons take on salary from a third team that gets Robert Covington. This would allow Portland to duck the tax. As you can see, they save $7.5 million in this trade. So if you just attach a Robert Covington trade onto it with whoever gets Rocco sending salary to the Pistons, you have a workable trade. I already dropped my Robert Covington destinations video, so go check that out. You can look at some of those trades and plug them into this Pistons one. So Rocco goes to the Bulls, Derrick Jones Jr. goes to the Pistons. We only have to take back a couple minimum salary guys, and we get Jeremy Grant, our first round pick, back, and duck the luxury tax, so this trade would make a lot of sense. The fourth team that I have as a destination for Norman Powell is the New Orleans Pelicans, who makes a lot of sense for CJ McCollum. I will talk about that in the upcoming CJ McCollum video, but they also make some sense for Norman Powell. I think that they will trade for one of Norm or CJ. In this deal, Norm comes into New Orleans and is immediately their starting shooting guard next to Devontae Graham, who's their starting point guard. Josh Hart gets brought off the bench there, in my opinion. They could also elect to bring Norman Powell off the bench. Maybe that makes a little bit more sense. Either way, they add some of the perimeter depth they need. They add some of the shot creation that they need. And the Pelicans, as I've said before, they have a $17 million traded player exception. So in a Norm trade, they can fully cancel out his salary without having to trade anything back. The simplest trade these two teams could pull off would be this: Norman Powell for a first round pick. As I said, the Pelicans don't have to send any salary back. Portland saves $15.5 million. Portland would actually get a $15.5 million traded player exception to use later. The Pelicans are still below the tax in this trade, and it's the simplest hypothetical deal I could see happening at this year's trade deadline. But there's a lot of other creative ways to send Norman Powell to the Pelicans and get a little bit more value than this. Here's the first example of that. I just went over the Bulls trading Derrick Jones Jr., Simonovic, and Portland's first back to Portland for Robert Covington. That obviously included the Detroit Pistons. It can also include the New Orleans Pelicans. You can fit Robert Covington trades into a lot of CJ McCollum trades or a lot of Norman Powell trades in a way that makes sense. Since the Pelicans don't have to match anything for Norman Powell, in this trade, all they have to match is Derrick Jones Jr. They do that by sending out Trey Murphy, Najee Marshall, and Didi Lazuda. Derrick Jones Jr. ends up going to the New Orleans Pelicans. As I've said, Portland can't reacquire him. And because I think Derrick Jones Jr. has a little bit of value, I think Portland could get back Trey Murphy in this deal, who was a first-round pick last year, 17th overall, who's a guy that I would like to take a flyer on. So Portland in this trade gets back their own first for Robert Covington. They do have to give up their second second, but that's still a good move. And then they also get a young player out of the Pelicans. In this deal, Portland would not only get a $15.5 million traded player exception, but they'd also get an $8.4 million traded player exception. That traded player exception would be calculated by taking Robert Covington's salary and subtracting Najee Marshall and Trey Murphy's salaries from that. The Blazers can cancel out Didi Luzuta's contract with a $1.7 million traded player exception of their own. So the Blazers get an extra traded player exception in this trade and a good young prospect. That would make a lot of sense. And just to showcase how flexible this potential package is, here's another Robert Covington trade to another one of Robert Covington's potential destinations that I listed in an earlier video. This has him going to the Minnesota Timberwolves. The matching salary for the Timberwolves is Taurean Prince going back to the Pelicans. And instead of getting Minnesota's first round pick back, the Blazers get Naz Reid. There's some additional salaries thrown in to try and keep the Pelicans under the luxury tax and create a second traded player exception for Portland. In this trade, they would not only get the $15.5 million TPE for Powell, but they'd also get a $4.9 million traded player exception for Robert Covington. And to really hammer home this point, here's another one of Rocco's destinations, the Memphis Grizzlies. The Grizzlies in this trade out Tyus Jones and Utah's 2022 first round pick. They get back Rocco, Kira Lewis, and a 2022 second round pick from Portland. Now, the first round pick from Utah might be a little bit steep, so maybe that's a second or two in this trade, but this would make a lot of sense for the Pelicans. They trade out Trey Murphy, their own first round pick, and Kira Lewis, and get back a backup point guard, which they need behind Devontae Graham. They really don't have anybody playing that role right now. And then Norman Powell has a place in the rotation as well. For the Blazers, they end up getting a $9.9 million traded player exception for Robert Covington, as well as Powell's $15.5 million TPE, and they get back 2 first round picks. Now, I'd be fine with this trade for Portland if it's just Trey Murphy, the Pelicans first, and a second round pick or 2 from Memphis. But you can plug in so many Robert Covington trades into this 3-team trade package. But with Norm going to the Pelicans and his salary being canceled out by their traded player exception, you can plug in Robert Covington to a third team, with that team sending salary back to the Pelicans and the Blazers getting all the savings from that sort of deal. So hopefully I've been able to illustrate a trade template in which Norman Powell goes to the Pelicans and then Robert Covington goes to pretty much any third team. The fifth and final team I have for Norman Powell would be him returning to the Toronto Raptors. Toronto has a pretty good starting lineup, but they don't have enough scoring punch off their bench. They're obviously very familiar with Norman Powell there in Toronto, and I feel like they might try to bring him back and plug him in his sixth man role. Apparently, the Raptors are major buyers at this year's trade deadline. A lot of forward targets don't make sense for them since they have Pascal Siakam, Scotty Barnes, and OG Anunoby, 3 really good forwards. So Jeremy Grant doesn't make sense. John Collins doesn't make sense. Ben Simmons, they've been tied to, but even he doesn't really make much sense, and Morey isn't going to trade him. So getting back a wing instead would make more sense for them, and Norman Powell, I think, could be that wing. The first trade I have is pretty simple. Norm goes to the Raptors. They match his salary by trading out Goran Dragic's expiring contract. Dragic isn't playing for them. Portland would essentially buy him out, and then Portland gets back a first-round pick from Toronto, which could be around the 15th pick. Now, this trade is really solid value for Portland, and I think the Raptors might do this. However, Portland adds $4 million in salary, so ducking the luxury tax would be extremely difficult, which makes it more likely that Portland tries to make this a 3-team trade with somebody else going elsewhere, most likely Robert Covington, with a lot of the same mechanics that I described earlier. So for example, something like this, the Bulls get Robert Covington, trade out Simonovic and Derrick Jones Jr. and Portland's first round pick back to Portland. Derrick Jones Jr. goes to the Raptors, and the Blazers save enough salary to get right around the luxury tax line in this deal. Now, Toronto trading out Kem Birch for Derrick Jones Jr., I think that might be something that they'd want to do, so maybe you can get them to give up an additional second-round pick, and that can go to Chicago. Maybe that has to be Portland's second-round pick. That doesn't really matter. But this is that same Robert Covington to Chicago trade that's plugged into a 3-team deal with Portland trading Norman Powell somewhere. The team for Robert Covington can change, the team for Norman Powell can change, but a lot of the trade mechanics through most of the trades that I've shown you today NBA are the same. Anyway, the goal of these videos is just to kind of get you prepared for the NBA trade deadline, and then hopefully once a trade goes down on Portland's end, you can understand all the reasons why Portland ended up making that deal. Maybe you'll be able to tell right away. And I want these videos to be entertaining, but I also want them to be educational as well. Now, we'll have the trade deadline stream for you guys to explain all this stuff right when it goes down, but I always enjoy trying to teach people about how these NBA trades work, the mechanics behind them, and I think knowing those things makes the trade deadline even more enjoyable for me and hopefully for you. Anyway, that wraps up this 5 destinations for Norman Powell video. Hopefully you enjoyed. Until next time, as always, peace out. Go Blazers.